So Pete.
Hi, nice to be with you.
Yeah, good to be here.
Yep.
I'm really excited because it's our first episode of our new podcast series, How to Live Well,
Yep.
which we are going to talk a little bit more, obviously, today about what that is about, why we're doing it, and it's something that we've talked about for a long time, actually. I was remembering the other day that we actually did a pilot for this, just you and me, in the middle of the pandemic.
Yes, we did.
The height of all the lockdowns, when it was not many people allowed to be in one place at one time at all.
I remember doing it. I've forgotten it.
So,
and you were doing everything, weren't you?
I did the audio, the cameras. You helped me arrange the set, and then we were in it, and I was having to remember to press record on everything, and it was
took us a few hours. Didn't it? It took us a few hours to capture that.
Yeah, it wasn't ideal, but it was useful.
Yeah.
But it's because we've talked about this a long time and had this idea on our heart, and not many. For anyone who doesn't know your story. Obviously, you've had a lot of experience, years of experience as both a church leader, but also as a medical doctor. But not only that, a medical doctor who loves miracles and sees miracles and celebrates miracles. And often when you tell people that, when people hear that for the first time, that grabs their attention, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. I guess it's a slightly unusual combination. And I've led a church since 1988, basically, and when I was a full-time GP, so we started leading the church, and I was a full-time GP with a young family, so it was a busy life. But I loved it. I loved doing both, and for me, there's never been that secular-sacred divide. It was actually, I knew that God had called us towards, Christian leadership, and that might mean church leadership, but always did that in combination with my medical practice and the church basically that we started and formed, which has become Eastgate, has always had that celebration of medicine and miracles, I would call it. We regard both as gifts from God and both essential for wellbeing, because medicine is obviously fantastic. I love practicing great medicine. I love the rewards that come from that. But also we recognise that it's got its limitations. It's got a lack of resources, particularly COVID realities have really brought that into the fore. So we need God's resources to supplement what we can do with our human resources of medicine. So I love doing it, and I love seeing God do great miracles.
And often, I guess, one of the reasons I guess it grabs people's attention when they hear that is they think, and obviously you touched on that, and we'll go into this more later, but they think, how can those things go together? They're incompatible, aren't they? And that is often the common mindset that we might have, and we think, how can those two things coexist well? And actually, that is the heart of really heaven in healthcare, and that's also the heart of this podcast. Is actually, why do they have to be separate? That really shouldn't be the case, and it's God's heart that people would have life and life abundant and be able to live fulfilling, healthy lives. And really, that's why we wanted to look at how can we have a more holistic perspective of being healthy.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Holistic in terms of its, you've got your physical, your social, your psychological, but also spiritual. And spiritual health is actually recognised more and more within the medical world as a component of holistic well-being and holistic care. And the evidence is that people with religious beliefs of any sort actually live better and longer than those without. So you can see the medical researchers has pointed towards the benefit of that spirituality. But actually, because I think there's been this separation of what I call the secular-sacred divide, which exists in lots of different realms of Christianity. But this is one in particular, seems to be this is quite a definite one where you either love medicine and don't embrace miracles, or love miracles, don't embrace medicine. That's a bit of a sort of a black and white caricature, but that's very true. And Christians often find themselves in one or either of those places, and not this what I call this holistic ground where you can embrace medicine as a wonderful grace from God towards the whole world. And we should celebrate modern medicine. We really should. But also alongside that, we've got a God who loves to intervene in and do things that we can't actually. So, and over the course of my life, I've seen so many wonderful miracles where God has done things that I couldn't do with my medical skills, and the whole of medicine couldn't do. So, cancer's being healed, and then a story I'm just about to tell, I think, that is remarkable. That really, I'd always believed it in one sense, but it really brought that reality to life in me, and also in so many other people. That story's been told all around the world now.
Yeah.
And it's an important story.
And I think what's great about this story is obviously it is really inspiring. It makes you just wow. You're like the wow and the awesomeness of God, but also just seeing how those two things can work together because and each playing their part in the sense of God doing what only He can do, but at the same time, when you have a group of people who are thinking differently and applying wisdom, that doing what only that can do in a way as well. And I remember the first time I heard you tell this story, I was like, wow. And obviously you've written about it as well in your book, Unwrapping Lazarus. So why don't you just share some of that now? I think it's just a great way to kick off the series.
Yeah. So it's right back, 1995, so this story goes back to. And I was going to Mexico. I've been asked to go to Mexico with a team of church leaders from the UK to serve churches there and churches that we had good relationship with. And there was a sort of a missionary outpost of one of these churches, really in a remote part of Mexico where an indigenous tribe lived, and they were called the Pame, and there's about 15,000 of them as an indigenous tribe. So they actually are a nation in God's sight. They're a tribe, you know. And they lived in this really inhospitable area, you know, where it's difficult to make any subsistent living. And they were the poorest and most bedraggled people I've ever seen in my life. And I've worked in the slums of Bombay. I've worked in mission hospitals in Kenya. I've done all sorts of stuff around the world. But these people, their circumstances were dire. Yeah. But also what was worse is that they were a hopeless people. And that was interesting, that they'd learnt somehow to be hopeless because they felt neglected, but also I think they had a lot of shame in them. And one of the reasons that they were living where they were was actually that when the Spanish conquistadors came through Mexico, they managed to escape them to this inhospitable place, and they ended up there. And so these were people who really were full of hopelessness and probably shame. And there's no medical facilities there whatsoever. Nothing. Not a nurse, not a doctor, no clinic, no nothing for all these 15,000 people. So they had nothing. They had witch doctors who they were really afraid of them, these witch doctors. They were powerful. And the stories they used to tell me about the witch doctors, so they lived in fear. And one of the things, they had some basic medical education of boiling your water and stuff like that, because their only water supply was their rivers. They didn't have no clean water supply, no wells, no nothing. And unfortunately, the rivers were polluted with amoebae, which caused amoebic dysentery. Now, that would have been simply solved if they'd boiled the water before they'd used it, before they'd drunk it. But they were so hopeless that they just had this fatalistic outlook on life, but they didn't really take much care of that. And as a result, 25% of their children died before the age of 5.
Wow.
25%.
Wow.
And that's a horrendous.
That's it. Yeah, that's shocking.
And they just accepted it. Child died. Okay, bury them. Get on. That is not a way to live. That's not living well, is it?
No, that is not living well
by any means. No. So, anyway, so I went there, and they wanted me to do some medical work, but they had no facilities. It was very limited what I could do, and what I could do. But also because we got up there with Christians, we thought, well, we can pray for people. So, cutting the story a bit short, otherwise I could take all this podcast telling this story. Was I was taken to a young, an 18-year-old boy who was paralysed in all 4 limbs, quadriplegic. And that was because around the age of 8, he'd been beaten up by a group of youths who's basically mashed his head and brain in with rocks.
Wow.
And so he just lived for 10 years in a just lying in a little reed bed in a hut that was basically made of sticks with nothing in between them. And there was a mud fireplace for a bit of cooking, and his mum who looked after him, but they were a little tribe, so she couldn't carry him. Occasionally, some of the men from the village would carry him out and put him in the sunshine just for a bit of relief. But apart from that, his existence was just in this little heart. It was horrible to see.
Yeah.
And the mum had no hope, but all of a sudden this doctor from England arrived, and I think they invested quite a lot of hope in my medical skill. Well,
yeah.
I looked at this poor lad, and he was completely, all his limbs were contracted. It's what's called spastic paralysis, which means in spasm. So his legs were crossed, his arms were he was all hunched up like this. He just stared at me, couldn't speak properly or anything like that. So, and they said, "Oh, well, what can you do?" And I thought, well, medically, this is couldn't do much in the UK. You could be a bit of rehabilitation, but desperate. And my heart just went out to him and to the mum. And I thought, well, nothing I can do medically, but we can pray. So we started to pray, and I had some friends with me. And I said, right, we're going to pray, guys. We're going to pray. And everybody was on it to pray. And so what I've taught myself to do over the years is for me, prayer is an interaction with God, not just a request to God, but actually if He's answering back. So I'm learning to listen. Because faith comes by hearing.
Yeah.
So I needed faith in that situation because I'm thinking a bit out of my depth in all of this. Now I'd seen things happen, some amazing miracles, but this was not. Yeah, the contextual it was horrendous. So anyway, we prayed for him, and as we were praying, God said to me, "Right, I want to take the blanket off his so you can see him." So I thought, okay. So I asked his mum through translation. She said, okay. So we took the blanket off him, and as we were praying, I noticed his arms and legs went floppy, which is called flaccid. No, he still couldn't use it. It was flaccid paralysis, and all of a sudden I thought, something's happening.
That's different. Yeah.
Now, what was interesting was I was able to notice that because I was a doctor. For the rest of the friends with me who weren't medical, they didn't know that how significant that was.
Yeah.
And that's why I think that the doctors should be at the forefront of healing, because they've got the eyes to understand some of the signs of what God's doing. So then I'm starting to be encouraged. I'm thinking, whoa, something's happening. And then God said to me something. He said, right, Pete, what I want you to do now is I want you to pick him up and put his feet on the ground and let him go. I'm thinking, aren't there any steps between?
Really?
Aren't there any steps between that blanket easy? And I said to the guys who were with me, I said, "This is what God's told me to do." And interestingly, one of them said, "No, you can't do that." I said, "Why can't I do it?" He said, "No." And I didn't realise until afterwards that basically he had a sister who had cerebral palsy who he'd prayed for repeatedly, who hadn't been healed. So he was locked in a disappointment in that room.
Yeah.
But my mate Andy Merrick, who was with me, said, "Yeah, go Pete, go Pete." I'm thinking, it's easy for you to say. You're not going to do this thing.
We're right behind you.
Yeah, exactly. It was like that. And so in this desolate place, I picked him up, and he had no weight to him because he had no muscles. He hadn't used any muscles.
Yeah.
So there's no muscles there. He was literally skin and bone. So I thought, well, even if you get rid of his paralysis, he's got no muscles to use.
Yeah.
So I picked him up, and our eyes met. I think he was a bit bewildered what was going on, and I had to turn him around. I faced him towards the door of the hut, put his feet on the ground, and I let him go, and he walked out the door.
Wow. And did you even need to say anything to him, or did you just?
No.
It's like he just knew what to do.
I didn't say anything to him. I just put him, and you think, how?
Wow.
And you should have seen the eruption of joy, the emotion with his mum, eyes coming out of stalks, the young missionary couple who'd been visiting him for months and months and months, they're jumping up and down.
Wow.
And he was known in that area.
Yeah.
He was known. So then he walked out.
Yeah.
Into the sunshine, and this gets me emotional. I will never, ever forget the smile that he had on his face.
Wow.
As he just looked around. And this massive smile.
Wow.
You see, that's what medicine couldn't produce that, but God could, and that's why faith is worth more than gold.
Yeah.
Okay, so cutting the long story short, we need to go forward to the afternoon, where basically, again, a long story which I haven't got time to tell, but basically we saw a baby come back from the dead.
Wow.
And again, this was known. It was in a very public setting. This kid had died, just died, and.
In the meeting, wasn't it?
It was in the meeting that we had in the meeting. She was probably dead before we got into the meeting, but she was actually, what's called chain stop breathing, so the death rattle, but she'd gone completely unresponsive. And you can read about it in Unwrapping Lazarus, the first chapter. If you need to get it, first chapter free on Kindle, just to test it.
Yeah.
Anyway, this baby was raised from the dead.
Amazing.
back from the dead.
Wow.
And so staggered, absolutely staggered. So obviously the missionary couple were amazed, and they had went off. We left and went home, obviously, but then the missionary couple told me that they actually had another incident where they prayed for a baby who'd been dead for hours, who came back from the dead. Anyway, so I go back the next year, and really thrilled to go back and see what's gone on. And when I started to walk around, I thought, oh, these people are different. They were now heads high.
Yeah.
Hope had arrived,
Yeah.
and they were no longer hopeless. And then the one thing that thrilled me more than anything else was that they started to boil their water.
Yeah.
I thought, wow. Now, because we'd seen a baby raised from the dead, we'd seen this amazing miracle, but now we weren't going to have to be praying for this baby, because this baby had died of amoebic dysentery.
Yeah.
Totally unnecessarily.
Yeah.
And what was going to change that? Well, hope arrived.
Yeah.
And it gave them a willingness to think life's more than this, and they started to take responsibility for their life, their health.
Yeah.
They bought water. Their children didn't die. They then actually dug wells, and the infrastructure of that whole nation changed. They got education. They got clean water. There've been churches planted all across the whole area. And
Yeah.
I literally saw a nation changed.
Wow.
In a day.
That's amazing.
But the boiling of the water was the sign for me that these were people where hope had arrived, and they were starting to take responsibility for their health in order to live well.
Yeah. That's amazing. And I think that just shows you, like, often, when we look at a miracle, we almost think that the miracle starts and stops there, where in our head it feels like it does. But actually, God births something in that, doesn't he? That actually never ends. It's bringing you up to a new plane in terms of how you see life, expanding how you see everything, yourself, how you see your interaction with God, and as a result of that, hope coming into your life, and also wisdom and all these different things that enable people to live more fulfilling lives as a result of that. What I think is really interesting about that as well is, like, imagine if, I was on a mission team that went to that same place, one of those villages, say 10 years later or something, and prayed for some people and saw some, like, young people, like, legs being healed and things like that. We would walk out of that celebrating those great miracles, not realizing that we wouldn't have even got to pray for those people if they hadn't been boiling water for them when they were children. Yeah. And that's often how we have quite a compartmentalized view of things, don't we? And how we celebrate, that miracle, God did that miracle, and yes, of course he did, and it's amazing. But actually, medicine and science was probably keeping them alive before then. Yeah. And that's actually a huge part of the story as well, isn't it?
Yeah. I think it is. We've got that. We've got our friend Patrick, who will be recording soon. Got an extraordinary story to tell, which we won't break into. But the story, if he hadn't actually had great medical care, he wouldn't have been alive for that miracle to happen. No. And that's so true. Many times you think people, often in cancer stories, you got people who've been kept alive and in one sense well, and then a miracle happens. You think, okay, that's fantastic, but let's celebrate the miracle of medicine that's kept people alive to that point in time, and then we'll actually help them keep living well. That's because medicine is not just about hopefully curing ill health, it's actually promoting full health, good health. And so putting these things together, and that's for us is Heaven in Healthcare is about that, is celebrating medicine and all healthcare work. Anybody involved in healthcare, we want you to feel celebrated that this is a God-given thing. Yeah. That, it's probably a profession that is so directly aligned with the purposes of heaven. It is heaven on earth because it's eradicating pain, sickness, health. So it's so obvious. But then to be able to also embrace the God bit of it, the stuff only God can do, recognizing that we do have limitations and lack of resources. And it's not just miracles. It's like learning to live in peace. And joy. That's living well. And so to create an atmosphere, which was another part of my life as a doctor, I could create an atmosphere of peace and joy around me, so that the well-being of the whole team was affected, and actually we were far more effective in our care of patients, and the patients benefited from it, because actually if they feel at peace rather than anxious, then that's be far more likely to get a greater outcome. Yeah,
and I remember you saying one time to me about how the goal of medicine is actually prevention, like that it's actually the big thing behind it is actually preventing people from getting things in the first place.
Yes.
And actually that is completely aligned with the Bible. The Bible's trying to do the same thing. It's trying to teach you to think about yourself in a different way, think about God in a different way, have healthy beliefs, healthy mindsets. And as a result of that, I guess, it affects how you operate in your spiritual authority, but it also affects how you look after yourself as well. Because if you see yourself valued in a certain way as a child of God, then you take care of yourself differently, all these different things. And actually, that in that sense, the purposes of healthcare and the purposes of God are so aligned in terms of what they're actually trying to prevent you getting ill in the first place, not just repeatedly try and making you better, but living healthy from the starting point.
I think that's really, it's really important, isn't it? So much for preventive medicine is, I sometimes say, I don't want to pray for my grandchildren to be healed.
Yeah.
We go, why? Why would you not want that? I say, because I don't want them to be sick in the first place. Now, if they get sick, I will pray for them to be healed, but that's not the ultimate.
Yeah.
The ultimate would be actually they didn't get sick in the first place.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, and I think there's a lot of talk about divine health, what that means and the pursuit of it, but I think it's just actually normal life. In creational order, as opposed to fallen order, creational order, it was healthy, and unfortunately, the fall of human nature introduced sickness into the world, and we live with that as a reality. But that's a battleground for us to take on, and actually, so celebrating when great medical breakthroughs, and a lot of the most notable medical historical breakthroughs have come through Christians.
Yeah.
Like Edward Jenner, vaccination. You got Louis Pasteur with pasteurization. You can just track many of them. Because I've researched. I thought, there's one. Not everyone. For instance, I don't think Fleming, who discovered penicillin. I'm not sure he had a religious beliefs as such. But so I'm not attributing it only to Christianity. But there's phenomenal breakthroughs, and in the COVID pandemic, I prayed for a vaccine.
Yeah.
Thank God we've got a vaccine. I praise God for the vaccine.
Yeah.
Which I find it very odd when Christians can't celebrate that gift and they're anti it, as if it's as if it comes from the opposite kingdom. But actually Jesus said a kingdom divided against itself can't stand. So you can't have, this is a brilliant thing at preventing ill health, And I guess people say, well, does it have any side effects? Well, everything does, So all medicines have risks, but life has risks,
Yeah.
And you don't live well by living in, without risk, do you?
No.
That's another part of living well. If I want to raise my kids, I would never want them to have any risk in their life. Then they won't actually become mature, healthy adult beings.
Yeah.
So that learning what risk looks like and benefits outweighing risk is the key to understanding medicine.
Yeah. And that makes me think of, I know you've used the seatbelt analogy before, haven't you? Do you want to just talk about that?
Well, I just think, I remember when I was a kid, we didn't have seatbelts in cars, and it was crazy. There was, and just sit on front seats or dashboard or just, but actually the dangers were obvious. Now, so when the government brought in a regulation, you need to wear your seatbelts, we go, tyrannical? No, this is necessary, and it saves lives. We don't even think about it now. I wouldn't dream, like my grandkids are 10 and 8 now, but I wouldn't dream of driving along thing without them strapped in. Why? It's just a normal safety. Why would I risk their lives?
Yeah.
It's just not an imposition. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
It can seem it can be regulated for, but there's lots. No, we get choices, don't we? And
yeah.
So it's stupid not to plug in, isn't it?
But isn't that that's trusting God though, isn't it, Pete?
Yeah.
That's faith, not strapping your kids into your car seat. That's faith, right?
But I think sometimes people think, we don't need to that because
trust God.
You could go back and say, faith would mean those Palme didn't need to worry about the amoeba in the water. Why boil the water?
Yeah.
But none of us think like that. None of us want to drink polluted water.
No. Give that to your kids.
Yes, none of us think that's a good idea.
No.
It's like, when cholera was discovered, in drinking water, great breakthrough. So you say, oh boy, this is a problem. Well, we'll say, go back to those good old days. We trust God for it. And that's nonsense. It's like, I think it's like if say, I trust God for my finances, therefore I don't need to go to work. He'll provide for me.
Yeah.
No, that's irresponsible, isn't it? So actually there's a responsibility that we have for our lives, our health, our well-being, and God doesn't leave us. God doesn't expect us to be responsible.
Yeah. Well, I've heard Bill Johnson say that, he loves hearing stories of miraculous financial provision and always celebrates them. And, Bethel, they do constantly celebrate those kind of stories. But he said it's God's heart that you wouldn't remain in that place where you are reliant on interventions to sort of rescue you out of situations so you can survive, but that you would learn to live in wisdom, so that you can have a kind of thriving life and you can become a source of provision for others. What I really want to know is, why do we accept things like that in those kind of areas, but we seem to struggle to accept that when it comes to health and medicine?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. There's not one easy answer to that. I think if basically pretty much everybody in the world who's old enough to think about this stuff has an opinion about medicine. They have an opinion about health, what does them good, what doesn't do them good, and we all do it. And you find something that works, attach great hope to it. Why it worked, it doesn't really matter. But it could be a placebo effect. It could have just been you were going to get better anyway. But it's amazing what people attach that to. And I think so. There's this sense of we feel we've got some wisdom, but it can be separated from God in many ways. This is funny that also, but actually you get into a victim mode sometimes with ill health. So actually, but sometimes people are just being rescued out of it. And think, hey, this is a great story. I've got another healing story for me. Got 15. Well, wow, that's great. But actually, wouldn't the great testimony be that you didn't get 13 of those 15? So we're not very good at celebrating that health. It's funny. Somebody asked me, is in our School of Spiritual Life, a supernatural school. And because I talk about praying in tongues 24 hours a day. And one of our students said, what does that feel like, Pete? I thought, that's a good question, because I've done it for so many years, I couldn't think. So I was thinking, what does it feel like? And then I had this thought pop in my mind. I said, it feels actually healthy, spiritually healthy. Now, what that made me think about is, when you wake up healthy, you don't take any notice of it, do you?
No, yeah.
It's only when you wake up unhealthy that you take any notice of it.
Yeah,
you say, oh, got a backache. If you get up, no aches and pains, and you just think, well, I'm getting on with life.
Yeah.
It's only when we're lacking health that we actually take notice of it. And then I think that. So maybe it's worth our while taking notice of our health and celebrating it, and then protecting it, and just being wise about it, and then. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
do you think also that because obviously healing it's a huge part of obviously the gospel stories and the life that Jesus lived and the life that he told us that we can live and that we can expect to see, and it's in lots of areas of Christianity, it's an area where people are talking about it a lot in the last sort of few decades, because we are rediscovering it, I guess, and actually rediscovering our authority in that area, and people are kind of rediscovering faith in that area, which is absolutely critical. And because it's such a talked about thing, and there's been lots of books written about it by famous people from the past who made great strides in those areas, such as Smith Wigglesworth and John G. Lake and such, and amazing people of God. But often because of the times and the context that they were in their day, medicine wasn't in the same place that it is today.
No.
And obviously, Bill Johnson talks about, learning to chew the meat and spit out the bones. And do you think sometimes we borrow sort of some of the viewpoints that they may have had from their day, perhaps understandably at times, and bring them into today? And that's actually what's holding us back, because it's unhelpful and outdated.
Yes, I've seen that a lot of times. Where I think, if we take somebody like John G. Lake, who was a phenomenal man of God. But basically, the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and saw amazing miracles. But actually, he was basically tell people not to interact with medicine. And I think we've interpreted that because they say, well, he was anti-medicine, but actually that was not necessarily bad advice in those days because it was brutal, the medicine, and it was so underdeveloped. So I think we are used to a world with anaesthesia, antibiotics, great pain relief, phenomenal surgical breakthroughs and skills, and they weren't there. In this day, they just weren't there. And actually, some of the stuff on offer was worse than what you had. You see, and because he was a man of such faith who saw extraordinary things happen, he said, "Come, faith, and where that's really risky, God's work." So I understand it, but when we then say, okay, he told us not to interact with medicine. If we don't fast forward and actually factor in the changes that have happened in, say, century, 120 years, modern medicine is phenomenal, and so this antipathy towards what was then, it'd be the same if you went back into the Bible times, when they said actually the lady who'd been bleeding, she said spent all her money on doctors, but was worse off really.
Yeah.
No, they didn't have the benefits of modern medicine. So, but medicine has changed so much and is continually developing.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth then we celebrate that development, and actually our minds need to it's like. You said when they first invented cars, you're thinking, well, they were useless. Horses were actually more functional than cars when they were first invented because there was no infrastructure, that wasn't very well developed.
Yeah,
we say, and they did tests on them and said, well, actually, you might as well own a horse. It's far better off owning a horse.
You can go anywhere.
You can go anywhere with it. You don't have to put petrol. There's no petrol pumps. You don't need tyres.
Can jump over stuff.
But we wouldn't dream of saying that now. You say, well, horse, you can ride a horse for life, but actually, automobiles then. Planes, you think things have developed, so we just have to make sure we actually understand the historical context for comments and actually make sure we put ourselves in the modern world and look at the benefits. The fruit of medicine is phenomenal in the world.
Yeah, and actually, the funny thing is that often even if we're hostile towards medicine, we are unwittingly benefiting from it without realizing anyway, all of us, whether that is medical science in terms of things where, like the water example we've talked about, or whether it's vaccine, even if I were to choose not to have a vaccine, I am actually still benefiting from vaccines.
You benefit from herd immunity.
Exactly, yeah. That's just a reality. And I think what's interesting about that story in the Bible, about the woman who's been subject to bleeding is often we forget that it's one of the people who documented that was a practicing medical doctor at the time. Yeah. So interesting that he obviously felt able to comment on that in that way, but at the same time also wrote the book of Acts, which is where the early church and the miraculous is. That's where we get all that from. And we get all that inspiration from, and full of amazing testimonies. God chose a medical doctor to do that. So even from those early days, God didn't seem to see a hostility there between those two things. He deliberately chose that person to do that.
Yeah, and it's same in back in the days of Moses. Actually, the law given to Moses was full of actually hygiene, and health and stuff, sensible.
Yeah,
and yet God did extraordinary things like their shoes never wore out. You're thinking, it's just extraordinary things, and they lived the provision they had. So they had God's daily intervention in their lives, and yet actually, like, this is what you need to do to be healthy.
Yeah.
Don't touch that. And actually, we look at it, it's very good. Lots of it was good hygiene. Now, when people say, oh, well, do we have to obey those laws now? Well, actually, a lot of those laws are not relevant now. But actually, there's still some stuff they say, well, actually hygiene is a good idea. Does God want us to be hygienic? That's not a legalistic idea.
No.
It's just sensible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I find really interesting is that actually we touched on this earlier about how there are aspects of medicine where it doesn't perhaps it isn't working perfectly in that area. There's still progress to be made. Obviously, there's progress to be made in all areas, but there might be areas where there's a genuine decision to be made, I guess, for the patient in terms of, do I go down this road or do I go down that road? And but we're okay in other areas of life with celebrating or recognizing progress, aren't we? And I think the seatbelt analogy is a good one of that. There used to be just the 2-point seatbelt, which had risks to it, but was probably still better than no seatbelt.
Yeah.
And then they invented, obviously Volvo invented the 3-point seatbelt and gave that free as a free gift to the world rather than keeping it to themselves, which has saved millions of lives. But we may well find at some point there's another sort of seatbelt or something equivalent that is invented that is even better than that. Now, you wouldn't advise people to stop using seatbelts right now because one day there'll be a perfect one coming. You would recognize that actually, no, use this one with wisdom, but there is progress to be made.
Absolutely. And I think that's the thing, medicine is continually progressing. There's lots of fields of medicine where there's still lots of advances to be made. And yes, I think I look at something like a keyhole surgery, well, that didn't exist when I was, qualified back in 1982. But, you think it's amazing the advances in surgery, then imagery, MRI scans, CT scans, didn't exist when I was first qualified. So so that level of specificity with regard to diagnosis, which is available now, is phenomenal. And that's a scientific progress. And it's so worth just recognising that this is, but there's still a long way to go. I'd say areas of neurology, still a long way to go in neurology. There's obviously overcoming cancer, but some of the advances in cancer treatment now are phenomenal, and things of gene therapies and stuff like that, which is another one. Actually, get onto that one. That could be a whole another episode in itself. Is what do you think about gene therapy and stuff like that? Because people get worried about the ethics of that, and I can understand it. Are we playing with something that we shouldn't be playing with? And but basically, I won't go into that now. But the advances are phenomenal. But what will they look like in another 50 years? It'd just be extraordinary. Hopefully we'll be living in an ever increasing healthier world. But also, this is a real dream of mine that within the next 20 years we'll have established Christian healing as a normal part of Christianity, but also acceptable alongside medicine as what I call a complementary service, which is what we managed to do, obviously, with our healing centre here, which was an extraordinary story, probably for another time. Yeah,
definitely. I think, it'd be great to talk about that at another point, wouldn't it? Yeah. And I think that, I guess the heart that we would want, one of the things we would want to convey, isn't it, is that where you see sort of imperfections in healthcare and areas for improvement and progress, that is not a reason to withdraw from that world. It's actually what that is an invitation to pray for more of heaven to come into it, and actually to seek to bring more of the kingdom into that world so that the two things can be working together. And I think over the course of these episodes, what we really want to do is kind of break down some of the unhelpful mindsets and hindrances and this kind of what we touched about with this hostility that is perceived to be there, that actually isn't there and doesn't need to be part of it, so that we can hopefully all live in better health just through a more holistic outlook. And I think we're going to be in future episodes touching on things like maybe even psychological aspects, even looking at things like potentially nutrition, things like that. And we'll have various different guests joining you, won't we, to talk about some of these things.
I'm really looking forward to it. We've got some great people coming up already.
Yeah.
We've got so many great friends who are part of Heaven in Healthcare with great stories to tell, but also outside of that, so it's going to be a fun ride, I think.
Yeah, so much to talk about.
Yeah, masses.
Cool. Thanks, Pete.